When a well-dressed man walked into a prestigious bank to cash a check, he expected professionalism, but instead he faced humiliation. What the bank manager didn't realize was that the man wasn't just any customer, he owned the bank. What happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. A crisp breeze swept through the busy streets of downtown Nashville, the sound of footsteps on marble floors and hushed conversations filling the air. Malcolm Johnson stood tall in his tailored navy suit, walking into the prestigious Crownstone Bank, the soft chime of the doorbell ringing with his entrance. As he stepped into the lobby, the polished wood and leather interiors seemed to embrace him in an air of respectability, a stark contrast to the deep, weighty thoughts stirring inside him. For years, Malcolm Johnson had built his empire in real estate development, mastering the art of negotiation, risk, and opportunity. But today, he wasn't there to discuss business or investments. Today, he was a customer, just like anyone else, trying to cash a check. It was an ordinary transaction, one that millions of people made every day, but the weight of this moment wasn't lost on him. The check he held was the product of years of hard work, a symbol of his success. And yet, what awaited him inside those marble walls wasn't a recognition of his achievements, but a harsh, unspoken judgment based on assumptions that would soon unfold. Malcolm Johnson approached the teller, his movements calm, confident, and precise. His expression was neutral, but the sharpness of his gaze caught the attention of a few staff members, their eyes flickering with curiosity and uncertainty. He handed over the check, and it was as if the whole room held its breath. The teller paused, her eyes scanning the large sum written on the check, an eyebrow lifting slightly before the polite mask of professionalism slipped into place. She needed approval from the manager, of course. Malcolm Johnson smiled faintly, a subtle acknowledgement that the system had its procedures. He had dealt with this before. But when the bank manager, Mr. Henderson, appeared moments later, it was clear something was amiss. The subtle glance, the hesitation in his voice, it wasn't just the usual process he was following. Malcolm Johnson, who had grown accustomed to subtle gestures of doubt based on nothing but appearances, sensed the shift in the air. Mr. Henderson's skepticism wasn't procedural, it was personal. Malcolm Johnson didn't flinch. He could feel the tension rising but kept his cool, his posture unbroken as Mr. Henderson's gaze flicked from the check to his face. The insinuations followed, questions about Malcolm Johnson's business, about the legitimacy of the check, and a casual dismissal that all but ignored the professional standards that were supposed to govern such transactions. What unfolded next wasn't just a simple denial of service, it was an assertion of superiority, an attempt to humiliate him in front of a crowd. Malcolm Johnson, knowing how important it was to stay composed, met each of Mr. Henderson's words with measured responses, his voice firm yet calm. "If this is about procedure, I'm happy to comply. But if this is about something else, you need to tell me." And in that moment, the uncomfortable truth began to take shape. Assumptions based on appearances. Mr. Henderson's suspicion wasn't about the check or the transaction, it was about the man in front of him. A successful, well-dressed black man holding a check for an amount that didn't seem to match the person standing before him. But Malcolm Johnson wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of success, a challenge to the biases that plagued so many. The tension was palpable, and it was just beginning. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, stood across the counter, holding the check in his hand like a piece of evidence he was reluctant to accept. His eyes never left Malcolm Johnson, flicking between the check and his face, as if searching for something that would make sense of the disparity in front of him. Malcolm Johnson's patience was wearing thin, but he knew the only thing that would guide him through this was calmness, so he stood there, still, unwavering, and composed. Mr. Henderson was losing his professional facade, the polite smile replaced by something colder. He barely glanced at the ID Malcolm Johnson had provided, and when he spoke again, the words felt rehearsed, calculated to dismiss rather than solve. "I'm afraid I'll need to verify this with the issuing party," he said, curtly, his voice flat and detached. Malcolm Johnson gave a slow nod, as if acknowledging the normalcy of such procedures. But this wasn't normal. This wasn't a case of routine diligence. Malcolm Johnson could feel it. The subtle hint of skepticism seeping into Mr. Henderson's words. The way his eyes narrowed, as if questioning not the check's authenticity, but Malcolm Johnson's right to be there at all. In that moment, the distinction was clear. It wasn't about the check. It was about who was standing before him. A well-dressed black man with a check for a significant amount of money, and that alone seemed to raise suspicions Mr. Henderson couldn't even hide. Malcolm Johnson let the silence stretch between them, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't just the disbelief at being questioned in such a way, it was the realization that Mr. Henderson's assumptions were rooted in something much deeper. It wasn't about policy or procedure, it was about bias, plain and simple. Malcolm Johnson could almost hear the murmurs from the crowd around him as he stood there, calm yet resolute. People noticed the disparity, and though many stood quietly, some exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. As Mr. Henderson turned to walk toward his office to make the so-called verification call, the tension in the room only deepened. The staff behind the counter tried to continue with their tasks, but the atmosphere was thick, suffused with the unmistakable energy of something wrong unfolding. Malcolm Johnson had seen this before. He had faced this before. The subtle discrimination that lurked just beneath the surface, unnoticed by those who didn't have to fight against it every day. A few minutes passed, but to Malcolm Johnson it felt like an eternity. Mr. Henderson finally returned, and his posture was different now. His face was more severe, the expression hardened, as if he had convinced himself that this was more than just a misunderstanding. He waved the check in the air, his tone taking on a new level of condescension. "This check raises some red flags," he said, dismissively. "Can you tell me where you got it?" Malcolm Johnson held Mr. Henderson's gaze, his voice low but firm. "It was issued to me as payment for a business transaction. Everything is in order." Mr. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. "A business transaction, you say?" His voice dripped with skepticism, as if to say that a man like Malcolm Johnson couldn't possibly have a legitimate check for such an amount. "Real estate, huh? Must be quite a deal to warrant a check like this," he added, his tone mocking. Malcolm Johnson's eyes narrowed slightly, the weight of Mr. Henderson's assumptions hanging heavy in the air. He felt the sting of the unspoken words, the quiet but insistent questioning of his place in this world, but he refused to let that sting show. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and earned everything he had, including the right to be treated with dignity in any setting. And yet, here he was, facing something far worse than disrespect. He was being reduced to a stereotype, judged based on how he looked rather than who he was. "Look," Mr. Henderson said, shaking his head as if dismissing Malcolm Johnson's explanation outright, "I'm going to have to decline this transaction." His words were sharp, calculated to shut Malcolm Johnson down before he could even ask for an explanation. "You can try cashing this somewhere else." Malcolm Johnson stood still, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his heart steady but his mind racing. The weight of Mr. Henderson's dismissal hit harder than he expected, but the calm in his eyes remained unbroken. "You're refusing to verify it. Why exactly?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Because of what? My appearance? My profession?" Mr. Henderson faltered, momentarily thrown off by the question. His defensive posture wavered, but he quickly recovered. "I'm following procedure," he muttered, but the words didn't carry the same weight they had earlier. Malcolm Johnson could feel the room closing in around them. The tension was suffocating, the quiet whispers of customers building into a low hum. And yet Mr. Henderson didn't seem to understand that this moment was bigger than a simple transaction. It was a reflection of something deeper. The bias that Malcolm Johnson faced wasn't just an isolated incident. It was systemic, woven into the fabric of daily life, shaping the way people were seen, treated, and dismissed. And as Malcolm Johnson stood there, his expression composed, he knew this wasn't just about one man making a judgment. It was about holding that judgment accountable. The air in the bank had shifted. The tension between Malcolm Johnson and Mr. Henderson was palpable, and the growing discomfort among the onlookers was hard to ignore. People around them whispered, glancing between the two men. The staff at the counter, once efficient and focused, were now visibly uneasy. It wasn't just the situation, it was the unspoken truth that everyone felt, but no one dared to voice. The assumptions made about Malcolm Johnson were clear, and they weren't based on facts or fairness. They were based on something much more insidious: bias. Malcolm Johnson, calm yet resolute, stood his ground. He had dealt with moments like this before, but today something felt different. His voice remained steady, even as he pressed Mr. Henderson on his refusal to verify the check. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for every person who had ever been judged unfairly, marginalized or dismissed based on assumptions about their appearance, background or profession. "Why not follow protocol?" Malcolm Johnson asked again, his voice cutting through the tension. "Why not verify the check as you would for anyone else?" His gaze didn't falter. It was firm and unwavering, challenging Mr. Henderson to answer, to confront the truth of his actions. But Mr. Henderson only hesitated, his discomfort beginning to show. The longer he stood there, the more the doubt crept into his stance, the more his own confidence cracked. It wasn't just about Malcolm Johnson anymore. The customers watching, some of whom had already sensed the unfairness of the situation, were beginning to stir. They weren't just passive observers anymore. Their eyes were trained on Mr. Henderson, waiting for him to do what he should have done from the beginning: treat Malcolm Johnson with the same professionalism and respect that any customer deserved. And yet, Mr. Henderson didn't relent. His posture stiffened, his pride refusing to bend. "I told you, sir," he said, voice rising just a fraction, trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping from his grasp. "I can't verify it right now. You can try another branch." But Malcolm Johnson wasn't going anywhere, not until this had been addressed. He wasn't here to argue for his own sake, he was here to make a statement. "So, you're telling me I'm not worthy of the same treatment as everyone else?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Because of what? How I look? The work I do?" For the first time in the conversation, Mr. Henderson faltered. His smugness, which had carried him for so long, was starting to crumble under the weight of Malcolm Johnson's questions. "This isn't about you personally," Mr. Henderson began, his voice weaker now, though still trying to retain some sense of authority. But Malcolm Johnson wasn't listening. He had heard it all before: the dismissals, the assumptions, the justifications that always seemed to surround moments like these. "You're making it personal," Malcolm Johnson shot back, his voice sharp. "You've made it personal since the moment you looked at me." His words were deliberate, weighing heavily on Mr. Henderson's conscience, and for the first time, the bank manager seemed to realize the magnitude of what he had done. He had assumed that Malcolm Johnson, a well-dressed black man in a tailored suit, didn't belong in this space, that he didn't have the right to conduct his business here. But that assumption was being exposed for what it was: bias, thinly veiled behind claims of procedure. And then, the moment that had been brewing for so long arrived. Malcolm Johnson, without raising his voice, without getting angry, made his move. He took out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke with calm authority. He wasn't calling just anyone. He was calling someone who could change everything. The silence in the bank deepened as Malcolm Johnson spoke quietly into the phone, only the soft rustle of his jacket and the click of keys on a nearby keyboard breaking the quiet. Mr. Henderson, now visibly shaken, stood off to the side, watching as the situation evolved from a personal conflict to a larger issue that demanded accountability. The sound of the door opening, the click of sharp heels on marble, signaled the arrival of those who would change the game. A woman walked in, her presence commanding and immediate. Behind her, two executives followed, their sharp suits and focused expressions making it clear they were here on business, not to indulge in any further delays. Malcolm Johnson, still composed, turned to face them as they approached. His demeanor was calm, but his presence was unmistakable. The woman, a senior executive with the bank, walked directly toward Malcolm Johnson, her gaze never leaving his face. "Mr. Charles," she said warmly, her voice professional but with a hint of respect. She extended her hand, and Malcolm Johnson shook it firmly. "I came as soon as I got your call," she continued, turning her attention to Mr. Henderson, who was now visibly rattled. The shift in power was immediate. Mr. Henderson, whose smugness had once filled the room, now seemed small, diminished, and unsure of himself. He stuttered when he tried to speak, his voice trembling. The woman didn't wait for an explanation. "Mr. Henderson," she said, holding up the check Malcolm Johnson had given him earlier. "This is a matter of grave concern. Mr. Charles here is one of our most valued partners." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "You didn't bother to verify anything, and you treated him with disrespect. That's unacceptable." The room went silent. The murmur of the crowd ceased as the gravity of the situation sunk in. Mr. Henderson's face turned pale as he tried to protest, but his words were drowned out by the calm authority of the executive. Malcolm Johnson stood there, his expression unchanged. He didn't need to say anything further. The truth had been revealed, the lesson had been delivered, and Mr. Henderson had learned it the hard way. He wasn't just a customer, he was a person deserving of respect, regardless of assumptions. As the executives made it clear that Mr. Henderson's actions would not be tolerated, the tension in the room started to dissipate. The crowd began to murmur, some nodding in approval, others shifting uncomfortably. The young teller, who had witnessed the exchange, hesitantly approached Malcolm Johnson, her eyes wide with both gratitude and awe. "I'm sorry for what happened," she said softly, "and thank you for standing up for yourself." Malcolm Johnson nodded, offering a brief smile. "It's not just about me," he replied. "It's about all of us. We need to do better." As he turned to leave, Malcolm Johnson's footsteps echoed through the bank, a quiet reminder of the power of respect, accountability, and the lessons we all must learn. The room remained still, but a shift had occurred. No one would forget what had happened today. As Malcolm Johnson stepped away from the counter, the weight of the moment hung in the air, thick with anticipation. He knew the next steps had to be calculated, but the tension, the assumption, and the unchecked bias simmering beneath Mr. Henderson's actions weren't going to be swept under the rug this time. He took a deep breath, the cool air brushing against his skin, his eyes briefly scanning the room. The customers had quieted, their whispers now replaced by a collective unease. It wasn't just about this singular instance, it was about the reflection of an institution, of a culture that was supposed to be built on equality and trust. Malcolm Johnson had come here for one reason, to conduct a simple transaction. But in this moment, his experience was not just a personal affront, it was a stark reminder of the barriers people like him constantly face, the assumption that because of his skin, his attire, or his profession, he didn't belong in this space, didn't deserve the same level of respect. As he moved to the side, his phone still in hand, he dialed the number he knew would bring about a shift. The woman who arrived was no stranger to power. Her sharp blazer and unwavering confidence signaled authority, and the moment she set foot in the bank, the room's atmosphere shifted. She was no longer here for pleasantries. She was here to ensure that what had happened didn't go unaddressed. The presence of her colleagues reinforced her stance. This was not just a minor misunderstanding. This was a breach of conduct that needed to be corrected. Not only for Malcolm Johnson, but for every other customer who might have found themselves in the same position. As the group walked toward him, Malcolm Johnson straightened his posture, his eyes never leaving Mr. Henderson, whose demeanor had gone from assertive to visibly shaken. The executive woman's gaze met Malcolm Johnson's with quiet respect. "Mr. Charles," she said, the professionalism in her voice standing in stark contrast to the dismissal Mr. Henderson had shown. "I understand the situation," she continued. "This is a matter of concern for our institution." Mr. Henderson stood frozen, unable to form words as the reality of what he had done hit him. The room, once charged with discomfort and subtle tension, was now filled with a palpable silence. The executive woman addressed him directly, her tone unwavering. "You failed to provide the service this customer, this partner deserved," she said, holding the check up for all to see. "What happened here today is not just about one person. It's about our values. It's about our integrity." Malcolm Johnson observed the exchange, his face calm but his mind racing. This wasn't just about making Mr. Henderson squirm. This was about changing the narrative, about showing that things like this weren't acceptable anymore. The power of the moment wasn't in the words, it was in the transformation of a situation that could have easily gone unnoticed into something that demanded accountability. As Mr. Henderson, his shoulders slumped, slowly retreated, Malcolm Johnson's gaze never wavered from him. The room was now fully aware of what had transpired, and for once, silence didn't speak of discomfort, it spoke of awareness. Turning his attention back to the room, Malcolm Johnson addressed the customers who had witnessed the exchange. "This is not just about a single moment," he said, his voice steady. "It's about what we tolerate and how we treat one another when we are seen for who we truly are. Bias can creep in unnoticed, and sometimes we all play a part in it. But what matters is what we do next, how we choose to act when we see it happen." The crowd shifted, some nodding in agreement, others standing frozen in thought. The tension had transformed into something more powerful, an understanding. For Malcolm Johnson, the battle was not won in this one confrontation, but in what it represented. He turned to the executive woman, nodding with a subtle smile of appreciation. "This is a start," he said quietly, "but there's more work to be done." As the woman assured him that steps would be taken, Malcolm Johnson turned to leave. His feet carried him out of the bank, and as the door swung open, a new sense of peace washed over him. He wasn't defeated, nor was he angry. He was resolute. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, misunderstood, or judged for reasons outside their control. The real victory, he knew, lay not in the apology or the gestures, but in the conversations that would follow. The power of this moment was undeniable. It was a reminder that the small, seemingly insignificant acts of everyday bias needed to be confronted head-on. And as Malcolm Johnson walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoed, not just through the marble lobby of the bank, but through the lives of everyone who had been touched by his quiet but undeniable strength. The lessons were clear. Judgment based on appearance or assumptions is dangerous, but change begins with accountability. And today, that change had started. As Malcolm Johnson stepped out of the bank, the weight of the moment stayed with him. The tension from the confrontation still lingered, but there was also a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had made his point, and now the ball was in their court. But the road ahead wasn't going to be an easy one. Change didn't happen overnight, and the biases that ran deep within systems like the one Mr. Henderson represented weren't going to vanish with one incident. But Malcolm Johnson wasn't naive. He knew this was just the beginning. As he walked down the street, the cool Nashville air biting at his skin, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the customers who had witnessed the exchange, their discomfort, their hesitation to speak up, and how that moment had shifted something in the room. He thought about Mr. Henderson too, whose arrogance had been deflated not by aggression, but by the simple act of being called out for his actions. But most of all, he thought about the young teller, Grace Taylor, the one who had quietly watched everything unfold, her trembling hands as she accepted his business card. The realization that perhaps her view of things, of herself, had just shifted too. Malcolm Johnson wasn't here to destroy anyone. He wasn't here for petty revenge or to make Mr. Henderson suffer. No, he was here for something bigger. His actions weren't just for today. They were a long-term investment in dismantling the unspoken biases that people like Mr. Henderson so often overlooked. The truth was, every time someone took a stand, however uncomfortable, it pushed the needle just a little bit further toward true accountability. Every time someone called out prejudice, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, it reverberated through the system, changing the people who witnessed it, changing the people who experienced it. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the executive woman, Cynthia Blackwell. The wheels were already in motion. The internal investigation was underway, and changes would be implemented. Bias training, increased oversight, a more structured complaint process. He read the message, but for a moment he didn't respond. These promises, though appreciated, didn't carry the same weight as the tangible actions that would come. He needed to see real change, not just words. Still, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The message was clear. Bias would no longer be tolerated, not when it was blatant, and not when it was hidden behind so-called procedures. His mind drifted back to his own career, his own journey, and how many times he had been underestimated or dismissed. It hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been a constant battle to prove his worth in a world that often saw him as less than. But today things were different. The power had shifted, and it wasn't just about him, it was about every person who walked into that bank or any institution expecting to be treated with dignity. Today, the system had been reminded that judgment based on appearance, race, or profession was no longer acceptable. And it was Malcolm Johnson's actions, his composure, that had made that point. As he walked past the tall buildings of downtown Nashville, the sound of the bustling city in the background, he knew that this moment would stay with him for a long time. Not because of the confrontation itself, but because of the ripple effect it would have. He had done his part. Now it was up to the institution, to the people watching, and to himself, to ensure that this moment wasn't just a fleeting event in a forgotten story. It had to be a catalyst, a starting point for a deeper conversation about fairness, respect, and the way biases were built into systems that touched every part of society. And as long as Malcolm Johnson had breath in his body, he would continue to be part of that conversation, pushing for change, one step at a time. As Malcolm Johnson made his way down the street, the bustling sounds of the city filled the air, but inside, his mind remained calm, focused on the impact of the events that had just unfolded. The conversation in the bank had been tense, but it was also necessary. There was power in confronting bias head-on, in exposing the uncomfortable truths that institutions too often brushed aside. But while Malcolm Johnson had made his stand, he knew that real change required more than one moment, more than just a single exchange. It required sustained effort, accountability, and a willingness to challenge not only the systems, but also the attitudes that reinforced them. As he walked past the familiar storefronts and cafes of Nashville, his thoughts turned to the bigger picture. How many times had he seen situations like this before? How many times had he been the one left to deal with the fallout of someone else's assumptions, their quick judgments, their lack of understanding? For years he had fought to prove himself, not just as a detective but as a man of integrity. Yet, despite his accomplishments and his commitment to the job, he still found himself facing discrimination from those who were supposed to be allies. In a way, this was just another battle in an ongoing war. A war not just against individual prejudice, but against an entire culture that had been built on unequal foundations. But today, as he walked, he felt something shift inside him. This moment, this stand he had taken, was different. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about his personal pride. It was about every person who had ever been unjustly treated because of their race, their background, or their appearance. It was about ensuring that the next time someone walked into that bank, or any institution for that matter, they wouldn't have to face the same humiliations Malcolm Johnson had. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The call to action was clear. It was not enough to simply call out an individual's mistake and let it pass. True change came when the entire system was held accountable for the microaggressions, the biases, and the inequalities embedded within its practices. And while he had no illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be, Malcolm Johnson knew this was a fight worth fighting. As he arrived at his car, he stopped for a moment to take in the scene around him. The people hurrying by, the steady hum of traffic, the city, alive with motion. For a brief second, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had done something that could spark real change. He had given a voice to the voiceless, a face to the nameless. But the work wasn't over. The battle for justice, fairness, and respect was ongoing, and Malcolm Johnson knew he was in it for the long haul. He pulled out his phone once more, his fingers moving quickly as he typed out another message. A message of gratitude to the woman who had been there for him, the one who had stood with him when others might have faltered. As he hit send, he thought about the bigger picture again. Change didn't happen in one grand moment, but in a series of actions, large and small. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would continue to challenge the biases of the world, one encounter at a time. This was more than just about him. It was about the world we all inhabited, a world where bias could no longer be tolerated, where assumptions were replaced with facts, and where respect was extended to every single person, no matter their appearance, their background, or their status. For Malcolm Johnson, the fight for justice was personal, but it was also universal. It was a fight for everyone, and he wasn't going to stop until every person, no matter who they were, was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. As Malcolm Johnson sat in his car, the hum of the city outside seemed distant, like the world was momentarily paused around him. His thoughts were clear but heavy, the weight of the situation still pressing on him. The tension at the bank, the looks, the words exchanged were all too familiar. They weren't new, they weren't even surprising. But what had happened after, what had been set into motion by his stand, was something that had the potential to spark change, to ripple through the entire institution and beyond. But even as he felt the quiet satisfaction of what had been accomplished, a small part of him wondered about the long-term effects. What would it take to truly break through the ingrained biases that ran so deeply through the system? Was it enough for a single confrontation to make a lasting difference? Or would he have to keep showing up, standing firm against each and every small injustice, one moment at a time? The truth was, as much as he wanted to believe that one incident could shift everything, he knew better. Change, true change, was never so simple. It was a constant, ongoing process, a battle against not just the actions of individuals, but against the deeper currents of prejudice and systemic inequality that often went unnoticed, or worse, accepted as normal. For a moment, Malcolm Johnson closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief respite from the whirlwind of thoughts, from the weight of the responsibilities he carried. He had always known the work he was doing wasn't going to be easy. But there was something powerful in knowing that his actions could be part of something larger, something that might inspire others to do the same, to recognize their own biases and challenge them. That small ripple of change was worth every ounce of energy he had. As he opened his eyes, he saw the world around him still moving, still full of people, each with their own struggles, their own fights for justice. Some might not even realize that what had happened in the bank today was a fight for them too. They might not yet understand the importance of confronting biases, whether it was in a workplace, on the street, or even within themselves. But that was the point. Change started with awareness, and awareness started with moments like this, when a person stood up and said, "Enough." Malcolm Johnson leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping the steering wheel as he reflected on his next steps. He wasn't going to wait for the world to change around him. He would make the change happen. He would make sure his actions weren't just a brief flash in the pan, a single moment of confrontation that would be forgotten in the next news cycle. No, he was determined to see this through, to push, to challenge, to confront every corner of complacency until it no longer had a place to hide. And as he drove away, Malcolm Johnson knew something deep in his bones. He wasn't just fighting for himself, not anymore. He was fighting for a better future, for those who would come after him, for the ones who might not yet have the strength to speak up, and for the world that one day might finally see things the way he saw them now, with eyes wide open, unclouded by bias or fear, and filled with nothing but the promise of change. Malcolm Johnson's phone buzzed again, a constant reminder that the world outside was still pressing forward, oblivious to the impact of the choices he had just made. The messages flooding in were mostly from colleagues, some praising his restraint, others congratulating him for standing firm in the face of bias. He glanced at the screen briefly, but put it back down on the seat beside him. His focus was elsewhere, on the next steps. The work wasn't done. This moment was a catalyst, but real change wasn't instantaneous. It would require persistence, patience, and unwavering commitment. The confrontation at the bank was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, one that Malcolm Johnson had been working on for years. He had always known that the most challenging battles were the ones fought in quiet spaces, the ones where the stakes weren't as obvious, and where people often turned a blind eye. It was easy to take a stand when everyone was watching, but the real fight happened when no one was looking, when the subtle biases crept into everyday interactions and shaped the systems that defined the world. As he turned a corner, Malcolm Johnson found himself wondering about Mr. Henderson. He had witnessed the manager's arrogance, the dismissive way he had treated him, the way he had refused to listen to the facts, and how it had all been rooted in assumptions. What did Mr. Henderson see when he looked at him? Did he see a detective, a man of integrity and intelligence, or did he see a stereotype, a threat dressed in a suit, attempting to cash a check that couldn't possibly belong to someone like him? That question lingered in Malcolm Johnson's mind, not just about Mr. Henderson, but about every person who had ever made a similar judgment. The phone buzzed again, this time from a friend in the department. It was a simple message. "You made your point. Now what's next?" Malcolm Johnson smiled at the simplicity of the question, knowing the answer was anything but simple. He had to make sure that this moment wasn't lost in the noise of the world. He needed to keep moving forward, to keep challenging the system, to keep holding people accountable, no matter their position, their wealth, or their title. And it wasn't just about police officers or managers in banks. It was about everyone. It was about each person who carried bias, whether they acknowledged it or not. Malcolm Johnson knew that his work would never be finished. But that was the point. It wasn't about the end result. It was about the continuous effort to create a world where people didn't have to question whether they belonged or whether they would be judged before they even spoke. It was about giving everyone a chance, regardless of the assumptions stacked against them. As he drove, Malcolm Johnson's thoughts settled on the young woman at the bank, the one who had quietly witnessed the entire incident. Her face had softened when he spoke of respect and dignity, and he hoped that, in time, she would remember that lesson, take it with her into the world. Maybe she would be the one to pass it on to someone else. Maybe, just maybe, the ripples of this moment would spread, creating a wave of change that would continue long after he was gone. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but if there was one thing Malcolm Johnson knew for sure, it was that the power to shift the tides began with people like him, the ones who refused to be silent, the ones who chose to fight for a better world, even when the fight seemed impossible. And so, as he parked his car and stepped out into the evening air, Malcolm Johnson felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of a new one. A chapter that he hoped would inspire others to join in, to stand tall, and to never stop demanding respect and justice. Because the truth was simple. Change didn't begin with big speeches or grand gestures. It began with each small act of defiance, with each person who refused to let their voice be silenced. And that, Malcolm Johnson thought, was the greatest lesson of all. The moral of the story is clear. Challenging bias and fighting for equality isn't a one-time act. It's a continuous journey that requires persistence, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Each act of accountability, no matter how small, has the power to create a ripple effect that can change the world. The story of Malcolm Johnson confronting bias in the bank serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against prejudice in our daily lives. It highlights that even when we find ourselves in positions of power or authority, biases, whether unconscious or not, can still shape our actions and decisions. In today's world, we must actively work to challenge these assumptions, just as Malcolm Johnson did, and hold ourselves accountable for the impact of our actions. For many of us, it's easy to fall into the trap of judging others based on appearances or stereotypes. Whether in the workplace, at school, or in social settings, these assumptions can create barriers, perpetuate inequality, and prevent us from truly understanding the people around us. But the key takeaway from this story is that each of us has the power to change the narrative. By questioning our assumptions, making an effort to learn about others' experiences, and actively practicing respect and empathy, we can contribute to a more inclusive and fair society. In practical terms, take time to reflect on your own biases and how they might affect your interactions with others. Commit to challenging them, whether by asking more questions, listening without judgment, or simply giving people the benefit of the doubt. Every small step toward greater awareness and understanding can make a profound difference in creating a more just world.